Wild animals usually steer clear of humans out of fear, so when a tigress approaches someone alone, the last thing they expect is for her to make an unusual request. The wilderness has always been a captivating and mysterious place, one that David loved to explore. Near a small village where he grew up, a vast forest stretched out, its towering trees forming a natural barrier. As a child, David's father often took him into the forest, teaching him how to track, hunt, and appreciate nature's beauty. As he grew older, he became a hunter, using his deep knowledge of the forest to sustain himself. He was skilled at finding the best prey, but he had no idea that his love for the wild would lead to an encounter that would change his life forever. It all started on what seemed like an ordinary day. At sunrise, David set out into the forest, eager to begin his hunt. Several customers had requested fresh meat, and his own supply was running low. Determined to make a successful hunt, David ventured deeper into the woods, hoping for a good catch. As the morning sun cast a golden glow over the forest, he felt a sense of awe at its beauty. By noon, he decided to take a break for lunch. He had already caught a few birds and planned to roast one. Though he found himself in an unfamiliar part of the forest, he wasn't worried. He could always trace his way back. Ahead of him, a clearing bathed in bright light signaled an open area, the perfect spot to rest. However, as he stepped into the clearing, he was met with an astonishing sight. A tiger stood in the center. David froze. The animal had clearly heard him approach because it was staring directly at him, but strangely it didn't appear aggressive. The great cat remained still, watching him calmly. Seeing an opportunity, David raised his gun, aiming at the beast. Yet the tiger didn't flinch, only continuing to gaze at him. Confused by its behavior and unwilling to shoot unless necessary, David hesitated. Slowly, he lowered his gun and cautiously moved toward the animal. The tiger let out a low growl and took a step back. That's when David noticed something unusual. This was a female tiger, and her belly was heavy with milk, meaning she had cubs nearby. He also observed that she was limping. Concerned, he softly called out to her, his voice gentle. Surprisingly, she seemed to relax, allowing him to approach. As he got closer, David realized the tigress was in worse condition than he had expected. Someone had shot at her, and the bullet had grazed her hind leg. The wound was infected, and she was clearly in distress. David instinctively wanted to help, but the tigress let out a warning growl, keeping him at bay. Then something unexpected happened. She turned and limped toward the trees at the edge of the clearing. Just as she reached them, David heard a faint sound, soft mewing. The tigress gently picked up a tiny cub in her jaws and carried it toward him. Setting it down at his feet, she turned back, retrieved a second cub, and placed it beside the first. David stood frozen, stunned by her actions. He wasn't sure what she wanted him to do. Was she asking for his help? As he processed what had just happened, the tigress began to move away, retreating into the forest. David called after her, hoping she would stop, but the big cat only cast him one last lingering glance before vanishing into the trees. He stood there in shock. A mother tiger would never abandon her cubs unless she had no other choice. Realization dawned. She knew she was dying and wanted to ensure her cubs' survival. David couldn't leave them behind. Carefully, he picked up the two tiny creatures and carried them home. Once back in the village, he took the cubs to a local vet, wanting to make sure they were healthy before he attempted to raise them. The vet cleaned their small wounds and assured David that they were in good condition. Relieved, he named them Luna and Leo. As time passed, the cubs grew into powerful, magnificent tigers. Their soft fur thickened, their stripes bold and striking. Playful and curious, they followed David everywhere, learning how to navigate the forest under his watchful eye. Their bond with him only deepened. Eventually, news of the tigers reached officials at a nearby city zoo. Intrigued, they traveled to meet David and see the animals for themselves. They were amazed at how strong and healthy the tigers were, admiring their beauty and presence. Impressed, they made David an offer, one that could secure his future. The zoo promised to provide the best care for Luna and Leo, ensuring they thrived in a conservation program. They even offered him a generous sum of money, enough to change his life. But despite the tempting proposal, David couldn't bring himself to part with the creatures that had become such a vital part of his life. His thoughts drifted back to the tigress who had entrusted her cubs to him that fateful day. The memory of her piercing eyes, filled with a silent plea for protection, was enough to solidify his decision. Selling them, he felt, would be a betrayal of the trust placed in him. So without hesitation, he refused every offer, turning down each proposal that came his way. Eventually, the day arrived, the moment David had always known would come. It was time for the tigers to return to the Gita wild. They had grown into magnificent young adults, their sleek, powerful bodies a testament to their readiness for life in the forest. David had spent endless hours preparing them, teaching them how to hunt, move stealthily through the undergrowth, and recognize the dangers of the wild. As he watched them standing on the edge of their newfound freedom, pride and sorrow clashed within him. He knew they were ready, but saying goodbye to the animals he had raised since infancy was almost unbearable. With one final glance filled with unspoken gratitude, the tigers turned and disappeared into the dense forest. Their movements were fluid, confident, leaving David with a profound sense of both loss and fulfillment. He stood in silence, listening to the rustling leaves, knowing that the bond they shared would always remain, even if their paths never crossed again. He was sad to see them go, but he understood. It was where they belonged. Years later, David ventured into the forest again, this time to hunt. But as he moved through the familiar trees, a thought struck him. He decided to visit the clearing where he had first met the tigress and her cubs. Though it was unlikely, he secretly wished that Luna and Leo might appear. When he arrived, he found the place unchanged, save for several peculiar holes scattered across the ground. Deciding to camp for the night, he pitched his tent, unaware that fate had something remarkable in store for him. The next morning, as he tended his campfire, movement at the forest's edge caught his eye. A massive grizzly bear emerged, stepping into the clearing. The bear spotted David almost instantly, and without hesitation, began charging at him. Panic surged through the hunter as he realized he had left his gun inside the tent. With no other choice, he sprang to his feet and sprinted toward the trees, the enormous beast gaining on him with every step. Just when it seemed like his survival was impossible, two streaks of orange and black shot out from the forest, positioning themselves between him and the bear. David's breath caught as he recognized them, Luna and Leo. The tigers, now fully grown, stood their ground, shielding him from danger. With fierce roars and powerful strikes, they drove the grizzly back. After a tense standoff, the bear, realizing it was outmatched, turned and retreated into the woods. David stood frozen in disbelief. The very animals he had raised had come to his aid in his hour of need. Once they ensured he was unharmed, the tigers silently turned and disappeared into the trees. David knew he would likely never see them again, but he was overwhelmed with gratitude. That moment changed something deep within him. No longer could he view the forest as just a source of livelihood. It was now a sacred place, a symbol of connection and respect. He decided never to return to the wilderness with the intent of hunting. Instead, he would dedicate himself to protecting it. Back in the village, David shared his story with anyone who would listen. Many doubted his tale, but his passion and sincerity won them over. The man who was once known as a hunter became a protector of nature. Determined to make a difference, he worked alongside the local veterinarian and a few village volunteers to turn the forest into a protected reserve. They raised awareness, held fundraisers, and collaborated with conservation organizations to safeguard the wildlife, especially the big cats like Luna and Leo. Over time, the reserve gained recognition, attracting experts and tourists alike. David became a guide, leading small groups through the forest, sharing his extraordinary story. Every time he spoke of Luna and Leo, emotion swelled in his chest, not just sadness, but immense gratitude. They had given him a priceless gift, the understanding that nature is not to be conquered, but cherished and respected. Years later, on one of his excursions, David paused in the very clearing where it had all begun. The forest was more alive than ever, filled with birdsong and rustling leaves. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. Two familiar figures, watching him from the shadows. His heart pounded. It was them. Luna and Leo, now majestic adults, had returned. They didn't approach right away, simply observing as if studying him. Then, at the sound of his soft voice calling their names, they began moving closer. But what truly left David speechless was what followed behind them. 4 small cubs, timidly stepping out from the bushes. 2 for each parent, their bright eyes filled with curiosity as they gazed at the man who had once saved their mother. David could hardly believe his eyes. The 2 tigers he had raised had formed a family. The cubs, protected by Luna and Leo, appeared strong and healthy. As Leo moved closer, his piercing gaze met David's, carrying an unspoken message of gratitude. It was as if he was acknowledging that the care David had given them had allowed this new life to flourish. Overcome with emotion, David felt tears stream down his face, tears of joy, wonder, and deep connection. But just as everything seemed perfect, an unexpected sound shattered the serenity. The sudden snap of breaking branches and heavy footsteps echoed through the trees. From the dense forest, a group of armed men emerged. Hunters. They weren't locals, they were strangers, likely poachers, drawn by the growing presence of wildlife in the reserve. Instinctively, David stepped in front of Luna, Leo, and their cubs blocking the men's path. "This is a protected reserve," he shouted. The poachers merely laughed, raising their rifles. Luna and Leo responded with deep, ferocious growls, their bodies tensed, ready to defend their young. David frantically searched for a way to prevent the impending catastrophe. Just then, an unexpected cacophony of sounds filled the air. It wasn't human. It was unmistakably animal. The noises grew louder, echoing through the forest like an oncoming storm. Then, the forest itself seemed to come alive. From the dense foliage, a wave of wild creatures emerged. Deer bounded gracefully into the clearing. Wolves stepped forward, with low, menacing growls, and even powerful grizzly bears lumbered in, their presence commanding. It was as if the entire wilderness had united, answering an unspoken call to defend its own. The poachers, once confident and menacing, now stood, frozen in terror. Their bravado crumbled as the realization struck. They were hopelessly outnumbered. Panic set in. Without hesitation, they turned to flee, stumbling over one another in their desperation to escape. In their frantic retreat, some dropped their rifles and equipment, which clattered noisily to the ground, forgotten in their sheer desperation to get away. David stood motionless, barely able to comprehend the surreal spectacle unfolding before him. The animals did not attack, nor did they act in reckless aggression. Instead, they moved in perfect unison, forming an impenetrable barrier that left the poachers with only one option: to run. It was as though the creatures of the forest had collectively decided to defend their land, their home, their balance. And when the last poacher disappeared into the shadows, silence settled over the clearing once more. David exhaled deeply, turning to Luna and Leo. They stood tall, their golden eyes locked onto him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. In that moment, they seemed almost otherworldly, as though they fully understood the magnitude of what had just transpired. Then, in a final gesture of acknowledgement, Leo approached David, brushing his head gently against him. A silent thank you, a bond reaffirmed. With that, he turned and, alongside Luna and their cubs, disappeared into the heart of the forest, vanishing like whispers in the wind. David stood in the now calm clearing, his heart pounding with realization. The forest was more than just a place to protect. It was alive, powerful, and capable of uniting against those who sought to harm it. From that day forward, his mission became clear. He would dedicate the rest of his life to preserving this magical place, for Luna, Leo, their cubs, and all the creatures that called it home. And so, David was no longer just a man telling an incredible story. He became a legend, the guardian of the forest. a living testament to the truth that when nature is respected, it gives back far more than one could ever expect.